people hear me? Okay, good. And we're gonna look back there. We're not gonna be able to see our PowerPoint, but you can go to the first slide. So, parts of this today I will be sorry. Okay, is that better? Kind of? Okay, if I move, Okay, so parts of this I will be reading today, and so will Abaki, only because of the time constraints, right, that we're on. So we wanted to make sure that we say what we wanted to say. But I want to start by introducing myself the way that in the Blackfeet community that we introduce ourselves. So in our community, we do not introduce ourselves by saying our name, right? It's considered, improper protocol. So in a lot of Indigenous communities, not just the Blackfeet, you wouldn't kind of go up to somebody and say, hey, my name is Rosalyn. You begin by saying who your grandparents are. And so you usually begin by saying who all four of your grandparents are, and not only introduce them, but also introduce the places that they come from. So part of our genealogies as people are connected to place. And one of the reasons that we do that is because we introduce our ancestors, and so it's a method of honoring our ancestors, and it's also a method of then creating kinship relationships. Because it's possible that somebody here in the audience could be related to me, right, or could be related to my daughter. And so you begin by saying what those kinships are, but it's also possible that you're from that place. And so those connections between people and place are very important to us. And so that is why we introduce ourselves that way. So, I'm sorry, I'm still having problems with this. I might just have to hold it. Wait, let me hold it, because it might be easier. I'll hold it like a mini microphone. So on my slide up here, just very quickly, so my grandparents are Ayukuma Amesback and Annie Madplume, and they are both from the Blackfeet Reservation on the south side, and they come from two different communities, and they come from two different bands or clans. I'm not going to say them, they're up on the screen. On my father's side of the family, we're Metis, and Metis is an ethnic group that is a mixture of both Ojibwe and French. My father's side of the family are actually enrolled members of the Turtle Mountain Chippewa tribe, which is in North Dakota, but we have always identified as Metis and not as Ojibwe or Native American. That's a whole nother issue, so you can Google it. And so those are who my family are. So you can go to the next slide. Thanks. Okay. So in my research and writing, I like to center the work of Dr. B. Metis, who, as I start to discuss contemporary social justice activism, which serves as a place to, thank you. Thank you so much. So sorry about that. Apparently it doesn't fit my head. So in my research and writing, I like to center the work of Lakota scholar Dr. B. Metis. As some of you know, she passed away several years ago, as an entry point to discuss contemporary social justice activism, which serves as a place to reclaim and recenter the role of Indigenous women as leaders of political and religious practice. As an Indigenous scholar, I see connections and continuities between contemporary Indigenous activism as places to revitalize historic practices of matriarchy or rematriation, as this group in Canada asserts, and as cultural places of the past where Indigenous women held leadership roles. The Lakota anthropologist B. Metis argued that women in Indigenous societies were often defined in Western scholarly literature as either dociles or drudges. And if not defined in these two categories, they were often defined as deviant. So Dr. Metis's research, she researched and wrote about gender in Northern Great Plains societies in an effort to reinterpret this docile, drudge, deviant categories. If you haven't read her work, I encourage you to do so. She did a significant amount of her research in her own Lakota community at Standing Rock. So she sought to move beyond the Western-defined binaries between male and female to include the multiple genders found within Indigenous societies and Indigenous concepts of duality and complementarity among genders. Her scholarship has pushed against the Western interpretive framework and reimagined Indigenous societies as they were before colonization in all of their complexity. Go ahead, next slide. So, as an environmental historian and Indigenous scholar, I'm fascinated with the past and relationships between humans and the natural world. I am particularly interested in a time period from the 1880s to the 1920s, which is known as the Progressive Era, right, in US history. It's a time in the United States that seemed to be bursting with change, social activism, and political reform. And it was a time when reformers embraced American science and emerging academic fields to help society's problems. My initial interest in this time period as a time of change led me to research and write about Native American activism. And so I was interested in how and why Native people chose to engage and advocate for specific reforms and voice their opinions about political, social, educational, and racial justice issues of the time. So I co-authored this book, City Indian, Native American Activism in Chicago, 1893 to 1934, and several related articles on Native American activism in urban Indian communities. During the Progressive Era, reformers were also thinking about new ways to think about the natural world, right? This is the time of the original conservationists and preservationists, the beginning of national parks being created. So I was also interested in thinking about how Indigenous people thought about and related to the natural world in their own ways and during that same time period. So I wrote my second book, which is Invisible Reality, Storytellers, Story Takers, and the Supernatural World of the Blackfeet, which is a history of my own tribe's view of the natural world. And I use that kind of as a case study or an illustration of how these ideas of relating to the natural world were passed down from generation to generation. But then it's also about the impact of colonization and how there really was violence towards Indigenous people, but especially the Blackfeet in terms of changing the way they thought about the natural world. So I'm now, as was mentioned earlier, I'm now working on a third book, which is called, tentatively titled, Plants That Purify, the Natural and Supernatural History of Smudging. And I'm returning to the same time period of the Progressive Era, and I'm looking sort of deeper into the history of American colonization, but in this case, particularly how it impacted gender roles, and how there is a difference in the way genders related to the natural world and how that was changed during this time period, primarily by the Jesuit order, which is part of the Catholic Church, but also because of American colonization. And most recently, though, I have been writing commentaries and articles about contemporary Indigenous activism, and so kind of a long list here, a few. And I argue that contemporary activists are setting out to reclaim and recenter Indigenous women as leaders of political and religious practice within their own communities. And in these commentaries and in my more contemporary writing, I'm really interested in connecting the past, sort of understanding our past history and how that relates to the present, and addressing some of the contemporary issues that are facing Indigenous communities today. So.
Hi everyone, thanks again for having us. As was mentioned, my name is Abaki Beck. I'm Rosalyn's daughter. I'm currently a public health graduate student at Washington University in St. Louis and a freelance writer. So today I'll be sharing my perspective as a student and talking about a few oral history projects I've been fortunate to work on the Blackfeet Reservation. So to start with my genealogy as well, on my mother's side, I'm Blackfeet and Red River Métis. My grandmother is Angeline Wall. She currently lives in Browning on the Blackfeet Reservation, and my grandfather is Bill LaPier, who's from Augusta, Montana. And then on my dad's side, I'm white American. My grandmother is Katie Beatty, who currently lives in Chicago but grew up in rural Ohio. And my grandfather is Armin Beck, who grew up in St. Louis, where I have now returned for graduate school, although that was not planned. So as a bit of background, I grew up in Montana, and then in 2015 I graduated from Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota, with a degree in American Studies. And my senior honors thesis was focused on the impacts of settler colonialism on Blackfeet youth suicide. And I looked at the issue by examining the historical development of Blackfeet society, of contemporary Blackfeet society, and by interviewing Blackfeet mental health practitioners. So through these interviews, I identified three specific issues impacting Blackfeet youth: absentee parents, substance abuse, and cultural loss. And I also looked at the current preventative work being done on the Blackfeet Reservation and access to Western mental health care. So in my thesis, I highlighted the importance of recognizing the structure of settler colonialism in combating youth suicide on the Blackfeet Reservation and for Indigenous youth more broadly. And I also talked about the potential of culturally based prevention initiatives on the Blackfeet Reservation. So I just talk about this project because it really influenced my current thinking in that it centered not only community-based solutions to public health issues, but also Indigenous knowledge and recognizing Blackfeet knowledge as just as legitimate as Western psychiatric interventions, particularly when talking about youth suicide in Indigenous communities. And it's also what really piqued my interest in the field of public health. So again, as was mentioned, after graduation, I worked in Washington, D.C. for Congresswoman Betty McCollum of Minnesota, first as an intern and then as a legislative correspondent. Oh yes, next slide, sorry, thank you. This position was really interesting in some ways, but it also made me realize that I was more interested in community-based work rather than kind of macro-level policy-based work. So I ended up leaving the Congresswoman's office to work for a few years on an oral history research project on the Blackfeet Reservation on food sovereignty, which I'm going to talk about later in our discussion, so I won't talk about too much now. But it was, again, a really community-grounded project that focused on using Indigenous knowledge as a solution to issues facing the community, in this case, food access and nutrition-based health issues. So during this time, I also kind of began a career or side hustle as a freelance writer. Writing is something I've always loved and drawn energy from, and after graduation, I realized I really missed doing research and writing essays. So I decided, hey, maybe I can make some money off this. One of the issues I've primarily written about is, of course, related to Native American communities with a particular emphasis on sexual and gender-based violence. Again, using Indigenous knowledge and community-specific solutions to combat health and other disparities facing Native American communities. So right now, one of the topics I'm really passionate about is gender-based violence and restorative justice as an intervention rather than mass incarceration. I'm currently working, doing re-entry at a prison in Missouri. And yeah, again, I'm really excited to be part of this conversation and engaged in a topic I'm really passionate about, and I'm glad to be here with my mother, Rosalyn LaPier, who, as you'll see, I think is very inspiring and has done a lot of really important work, both in academia and on the community level, to revitalize Blackfeet knowledge and recognizing that Indigenous knowledge is a legitimate form of knowledge and not just, folklore or other degrading terms that people might use. Yes. Thank you for having me.
Okay, I guess I better use this. So new research tells us that in the past 2 years, 20% of Americans, and for those of you who are not math majors, 1 in 5, participated in a protest, rally, march, demonstration, or political campaign event, many for the first time. And less than half of those who showed up for a rally or a march identified as, quote unquote, an activist. This may be because Americans often identify activism with violence and extremism, as the study revealed. This study also learned that more than 25% of Americans did more than just attend a rally or a march. They engaged in direct actions on a regular basis. And by direct action, they meant things like calling your senator's office, writing a letter to the editor. So the direct action was not often something that took much more effort than showing up at a rally. And so they found out that 25% of people were engaged in direct actions where they tried to influence government policy on issues that they were interested in. So this research, which is one of the most extensive studies of political protesters in the last 10 years, examined why people were motivated to engage civically. And it revealed that between 2016 and 2018, did I do that right? Yeah. Over 45% of Americans were engaged in some form of activism in the United States. So, however, I'm interested personally in addressing and researching and writing about Indigenous activism, especially the activism of women. And I argue that for Indigenous communities, a shift occurred beginning about 20 years ago when women, girls, and Two-Spirit people began to not just participate, but to lead the actions within public spheres as a part of an effort to revitalize women-centered both religious practice and political action. So I just want to stop and say, I recognize, obviously, that activism has been happening for a very long time, because I've been researching it since the 19th century to the present, but I really do think a shift has occurred since the turn of the last century of there being a real effort to change who is at the center of leadership within Indigenous communities, because a lot of Indigenous communities have historically been matriarchal, and because of American colonization, it moved from matriarchy to patriarchy. And so there's been a real push recently for that to change, but then also for that to change within public spaces. So not just at home, kind of behind closed doors, but also in public spaces around activism. And so that's one of the things I'm interested in working on and writing about. And anyway, I'll keep going. So it began with women such as, this is just several examples here, it began with women such as Ojibwe elder Josephine Mandamin, who recently passed away, as some of you may know. She started an Indigenous movement in Canada and the Great Lakes called Water Walkers, where women walk on long journeys around or along waterways to bring awareness to our human dependence and spiritual connection to water. They carry water in copper buckets in accordance with Anishinaabe ceremonial traditions. And copper, as you may know, is an indigenous metal from the Great Lakes. I often get asked the question, like, why are they using copper and not like wood or rawhide? It is an indigenous metal that the Anishinaabe have been using for thousands of years. And Josephine Mandelman has explained that as women, we are carriers of the water. We carry life for the people. She is most well known for her walks around the Great Lakes. She held her first 11,000-mile walk around the Great Lakes in 2003. On these journeys, she is joined by other Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit, such as Tasha Beeds, who is another Indigenous scholar, who has expressed that these walks are very much a prayer. They are like a walking prayer. The water walkers view their walking not just as a mode of transportation, but as a ritual process in itself. Viewed this way, they are not a protest necessarily against something, but an action to revitalize Indigenous religious practices and bring healing to our world. Josephine Mandelman's work is carried on today by the next generation of water walkers and activists, such as Autumn Peltier. I think Autumn is now 14. She was 13 last fall. Autumn Peltier recently spoke to the United Nations on World Water Day, where she stated that many people do not think water is alive or has a spirit. Our water deserves to be treated as human with human rights. We need to acknowledge our waters with personhood. So in Lethbridge, Alberta, the Sisters in Spirit Vigils began in 2006, which set out to bring awareness to the missing and murdered Indigenous women, or MMIW, in Canada. These actions grew out of gatherings such as the Highway of Tears Vigils, which began in 1998 in British Columbia, which drew attention to women who had gone missing or murdered along an industrial highway in northern Canada. MMIW vigils, walks, and rallies have now spread from Canada to the United States. Women activists began attending these prayer vigils wearing jingle dresses, which are viewed as having the power to heal people and places. So recently, Ojibwe scholar Brenda Child has been researching the history of jingle dresses as healing dresses, and she will be featured, or her work will be featured in a new exhibit at the Mille Lacs Tribal Museum and the opening in Minnesota, and the opening is on May 3rd. There's also a video that they did recently on the history of jingle dresses. The use of religious artifacts and iconography, such as jingle dresses, within women-led activism spread from these initial efforts. So in 2012, the Canadian government, led by Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper, passed 2 omnibus bills to overhaul their governmental policies and procedures and pass a new budget. Opponents argued that the new bills would reduce Indigenous people's sovereignty and dismantle key environmental protections, which they ultimately did. Opponents feared that Indigenous lands would continue to serve as places of resource extraction and environmental degradation. A new group formed called Idle No More, which was organized by 4 women, 3 Indigenous and 1 non-Indigenous. The CBC News wrote that they oppose changes they say would allow for easier opening of treaty lands and territory. They also oppose amendments that would remove protection from some rivers and lakes and speed up the approval process for projects that would affect the environment. So Idle No More organized a national day of protest on December 21st, 2012, 1 week after the second omnibus bill was passed. Thousands gathered on Parliament Hill in Ottawa in large cities and small hamlets across Canada. So these gatherings were led by Indigenous women, many wearing jingle dresses, as you can see from the photo here. Over the course of the winter of 2012 and 2013, Idle No More organized, primarily using social media, hundreds of marches, rallies, and what they called flash mob round dances, in an effort to raise awareness about environmental racism and environmental justice issues in Canada. But something else was occurring, and this is what I'm interested in addressing in my research and writing, when I'm looking at these connections between activism and as it's occurring over time. And one of the things that I think is that, you know, when we think of activism, oftentimes we think of it just sort of occurring in the moment, and almost always it's not occurring in the moment because there's a connection to something that happened before that, that's something that happened before that, that's something that happened before that. And for those of us who are, you know, historians and more interested in those connections, we try to find and figure out what those connections are, which is why when I'm looking at this time period, again, I'm kind of looking over 20 years of time that I'm seeing connections between, again, women-led activism and women-led protest, but also a connection to how women are thinking about activism differently and centering it as a spiritual practice, not just kind of a political action, but actually a spiritual practice. And a lot of Indigenous women's activism now, I believe, are becoming places that where ritual and prayer and ceremony happen. And they're also becoming places where, because that is happening, people are now recognizing that and expecting it. So when not only Indigenous people attend a protest that's been organized by Indigenous women, they're not expecting just sort of a traditional protest, they're expecting ceremony to happen, right? They're expecting a religious experience to happen. And so that is something that has been evolving over these last 20 years. So, now that I've said that, skip that page. So as the women on Parliament Hill, just FYI, Parliament Hill is like their Washington, D.C., right? Parliament Hill in Ottawa, with their presence and prayer, wearing their jingle dresses and carrying religious icons, they were sanctifying it with their presence. And they were sanctifying this space that is the head, the seat of government, with Indigenous, kind of re-indigenizing that place and sanctifying it with their religious activism. So these movements, such as Water Walkers, Sisters in Spirit, Idle No More in Canada, organized by women activists and concerned with social and environmental justice and revitalizing Indigenous women's roles, helped set the stage for Standing Rock in the United States. We all know what happened there, so I'm not going to talk about that. But I just want to say that Standing Rock also began through the leadership of Indigenous women, through girls and Two-Spirit people, and that it began as many people recognized from the beginning as a spiritual resistance towards the impact, again, of environmental racism. So. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, yes. Okay, so one of the things that Métis scholar Gregory, what's his last name?
Lowen-Trudeau.
One of the things that Gregory Lowen-Trudeau talks about is that Indigenous activism is not only resistance, but also needs to include revitalization and recreation for the world that we are interested in building. So this notion of revitalization and recreation can really be seen with the contemporary food sovereignty movement, which some of you might be aware of. So essentially, food sovereignty are tribal efforts to recreate local, sustainable, and traditional food systems that prioritize community needs over profits, and has been one of the major ways that tribal communities, particularly led by young people and women, have been combating disparities driven by colonial policies. So food sovereignty looks different for every tribe because it's based on community need and tribal tradition. But food sovereignty is vital for communities for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, for cultural preservation and revitalization. With elders passing away and a lot of knowledge not being passed down, it's really important to talk to elders, record their stories, record their knowledge, and educate younger folks. Additionally, as many of you know, Native Americans face a lot of health disparities, some of which are closely linked to nutrition, like diabetes and heart disease. And of course, what we eat and what kind of food we have access to, a lot of reservations are food deserts, really impacts our health and well-being. And finally, as Rosalyn was talking about, it's important to learn about traditional foods and food sovereignty because of its impact on the environment and issues of environmental racism and environmental justice, particularly considering that climate change will continue to impact what time of year we can gather, what time of year we can hunt, etc. So as I mentioned, shortly after I left DC, I began a community-based research project on food sovereignty on the Blackfeet Reservation. So for this project, I spent a year interviewing 9 Blackfeet elders, predominantly women, to preserve their traditional ecological knowledge and to propose solutions to reservation health disparities. It was the first study to exclusively focus on Blackfeet traditional foods and food sovereignty, and the research really worked to recognize, again, elder ecological knowledge as just as relevant and just as valuable as Western medical research, particularly when looking at health disparities in Indigenous communities, which have essentially been caused and exacerbated by federal colonial policies. So the research resulted, in a policy advocacy guide, a final report, and a bunch of educational events on and off the reservation. And I've also been invited to present at a few national conferences on Native health. Because the goal of the work was really to revitalize the use of traditional plants, I was very fortunate to have grown up picking traditional plants and traditional medicine with my relatives, because a lot of my older relatives still use traditional medicine. But that's not the case for many, many people in our community. So I didn't just ask elders, about their lives, but really specific, okay, how did you collect that plant? Where did you collect it? What time of year? How did you clean it? How did you process it? How do you brew that tea? How did you make that recipe? So that families who don't have access to elders who might have that knowledge, for example, if they went to residential boarding school, or if they just don't have people in their families that have that knowledge, that they're able to, educate themselves on traditional Blackfeet foods. So from these interviews, several prominent themes emerged. First, that traditional foods were and still are used by members of the Blackfeet community. I think it's kind of a stereotype that all Native culture has died or was all eradicated by colonialism. There are still a lot of people who hold traditional knowledge and practice traditional knowledge and traditional, foods and medicines in many communities. Also, that modifications to traditional foods were made based on income and accessibility to affordable foods. So one of the things the elders talked about was that one of the reasons they use traditional foods or traditional medicines now as more of a supplement to their diet as opposed to their full diet is because they have a car, they can go to the grocery store, there's grocery stores on the reservation, not that it's necessarily high quality food, but that they have access to different types of food than they did when they were growing up. Another thing that's really important is that kinship and community togetherness were really important factors in their childhood and making sure that everyone in the community was fed, which they unfortunately said they didn't see as prominent today. And then of course, unsurprisingly, they noted that traditional food has unfortunately dramatically decreased since their childhood. And then in terms of looking towards the future, the elders suggested that the tribe sell locally hunted wild game and processed bison, be sold at the tribally run grocery store, that the tribe start a community garden, particularly to help feed elders and young people. And then they also suggested that there should be more educational opportunities for people to learn about nutrition and traditional foods. And they particularly talked about the need for classes for new parents. So this is just one example of food sovereignty efforts, but these sort of things are really going on across the nation. again, primarily led by young people and primarily led by women in a lot of cases. As some of you might be aware, the Oneida Reservation outside of Green Bay holds a really great annual food sovereignty conference, and they've done a lot of great work in promoting local foods, native-made foods, and educating community members on traditional foods. But all of these efforts reflect that revitalization of Indigenous knowledge and land relations isn't just about remembering traditions, but about addressing very real contemporary issues like diabetes, like access to food, etc. So.
Yeah. No. So we're deciding on the fly. Let's go. So one of the things that one of the themes that we wanted to present today is that when people think about Indigenous activism or any activism, we often think of resistance first, right? That activism is resistance. And one of the things that we wanted to share with everyone here and bring as a point of discussion, because I know that there'll be discussion later, is that that activism is not often resistance in a lot of Indigenous communities. Activism is often revitalization. So whether it's revitalization of Indigenous languages, revitalization of traditional food systems, revitalization of Indigenous knowledge, or in the things that I'm interested in, revitalization of women's roles as leaders of religious practice and political action, that there's always these two themes going on, both resistance and revitalization at all times. It's not always often what you see in social media, right, or as I said, mainstream media, that it's resistance is what the research that recently came out said, that when people think of activism, right, they think of violence and extremism. And what we are seeing in a lot of Indigenous communities is that the activism that we see occurring within the community itself, not in public spheres often, is this revitalization and thinking about different ways of knowing.
Sure, so just to go off that, tied to both of our, research interests is the importance of revitalizing Indigenous knowledge and centering Indigenous knowledge. Too often, particularly in our fields, public health and environmental science, Indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge isn't seen as legitimate, isn't seen as evidence-based, isn't seen as rigorous, and essentially, oftentimes in academia and just mainstream society, mainstream society, we only think of Western knowledge or Western science as reality or as the truth because it's seen as unbiased. That, as I'm sure we all know, or should know, Western knowledge, you can't separate Western knowledge from its history of racism, colonialism, homophobia, sexism. As I mentioned and related to the Food Sovereignty Project, my great-grandmother was a Blackfeet botanist. I grew up picking roots and plant medicines with my aunts, grandmother, cousins, mother, and making root medicine is a much more involved process than going to the store to buy Tylenol. You have to know what time of year to pick, what time of day to pick, how to clean, dry, and process the plants, how long a tea or rub can be used before it loses its potency. So it's a really involved process. And one of the reasons that my family still uses traditional medicine is because it works, not because, we're just, hippies going into the land. It actually works and has chemical medicinal properties. Yet Native American ecologists, botanists, geneticists aren't seen as legitimate scientists. And oftentimes when we talk about knowledge today, we talk about, peer-reviewed research and, by university professors such as yourselves. And academia is really seen as the pinnacle of knowledge. And again, there's this assumption that science or Western knowledge is not only strongly supported by evidence, but is also unbiased, nonpartisan, and essentially universal. But as with all aspects of Western society, science is deeply tainted by the legacies of colonialism and racism. And Western science has really viciously exploited marginalized communities through forced experimentation and simultaneously worked to discredit non-Western scientific thought. So I think it's really important to frame this conversation with history and not just think that this emphasis on revitalization of Indigenous knowledge and centering Indigenous knowledge is coming out of the blue. So many of you may be familiar with social Darwinism, which essentially applied a scientific theory to the non-scientific realm, and was developed in the 1850s by the British scientist and philosopher Herbert Spencer. So the idea posits that, similar to Darwin's theory on natural selection, some cultures are inherently weaker than others, and thus would naturally be lower social classes and eventually die out, making way for naturally stronger and more prominent cultures. Unsurprisingly, his theory was predominantly used to assert the superiority of Western European culture and society. So for generations, scientific racism and the theory of social Darwinism has justified racism, imperialism, and other violence towards non-native or non-white, and non-Western cultures. So then eugenicists took this idea a step further. Eugenics, which came into vogue in the 20th century, takes cues from biology and genetics. And as with social Darwinism, eugenics applied a theory related to the natural world to the human world, in this case on selective breeding. So the eugenics movement, which you may be aware of, advocated for genetically breeding humans to essentially create perfect people, as well as extirpate traits that they deemed to be undesirable. So in order to breed out undesirable traits, eugenicists supported forced sterilization in predominantly lower income communities and communities of color. And this extreme and overt violence surged in popularity in the 1920s and 30s as xenophobic and racist fears spread across the United States. And the movement was also supported by the Supreme Court in 1927 with Buck versus Bell, which ruled that state-sanctioned forced sterilization was legal, and the decision has never been overturned. And then speaking about Native American communities specifically, in the 1960s and 70s, it's estimated that between 25 and 50% of Native American women were sterilized, many of which were forced sterilizations and many of which occurred in government-run Indian Health Service facilities. So this use of people of color, and in many cases Black people and Indigenous people specifically, for scientific study was often used to help justify white supremacy and racial hierarchy. So for example, in 1951, Dr. Samuel Cartwright coined the then accepted term drapetomania, not sure how to pronounce it, to pathologize the mental state of slaves who escaped or attempted to escape slavery. Similarly, Dr. Cartwright argued that slaves' disobedience or refusal to work could be explained by the mental disorder, again, not sure how to pronounce it, called dysthenia ethiopica. But what's important about that is that it was essentially branding slaves' resistance to bondage and white violence as a diagnosable, legitimate mental illness or mental disorder. So at the same time that medical experimentation on Black people, or at the time I should say, that experimentation on Black people was legal because they were slaves and property, essentially. But even after slavery, this sort of extreme violence continues in communities of color. So one of the more famous ones in the 1930s was in collaboration with Tuskegee University, the US government purposefully infected thousands of Black men in Alabama with syphilis and then left them untreated for 4 decades in order to track the course of the disease and experiment with possible treatments. In the 1940s and 50s, Johns Hopkins University purposefully infected orphans, mental health patients, and incarcerated people in Guatemala, again with syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases. And hundreds of Guatemalans are actually currently suing Johns Hopkins for having not only been purposely infected, but also denied medical treatment. And such experiments have also been conducted on children of color. In the 1940s and 50s, 6 government-run boarding schools in Canada forced Indigenous students into nutrition experiments. Some students were fed a regular diet, whereas others were fed mere vitamin supplements or nutrient-enhanced flour. And the children were also denied dental care, even if it had been previously available to them. And one of the disturbing goals of this study was to observe how the human body reacts to malnutrition. So just like the Guatemalans who are suing Johns Hopkins, many of these children are still alive today, and them and their family members and communities are still being impacted by this extreme trauma and violence, in the name of Western science and knowledge production. So while scientific racism is today looked at as a school of thought of the past, or no longer legitimate, it's important to recognize that for many, many years, it informed social thought, it informed policy, it informed how we developed medications, it informed how we developed what is categorized as a mental illness, etc. So I just say all of this because we need to recognize that Western scientific advancements were made because of the exploitation of communities of color. And by creating scientific arguments for dehumanizing the minds and bodies of people of color, these experiments not only impacted the exploited individuals themselves, but also had wide-reaching implications for their communities. So, next slide. So this history is one of the reasons that why many young people of color and many indigenous people today are interested in critiquing the idea of knowledge production as a form of activism, recognizing that valuing Western science or Western knowledge over the knowledge of indigenous communities and other communities of color maintains colonial and white supremacist perspective that for centuries deemed people of color as biologically inferior and supported using our bodies and communities as literal test subjects. So revitalizing and being empowered by indigenous knowledge is not just about connecting to our ancestors, but it's recognizing that a lot of the issues in our communities today won't be solved by the systems that created these conditions. And this is again tied to the idea that activism is not only efforts to resist, but also to revitalize and recreate the world as we want to see it. So this revitalization and recreation takes many forms, as Rosalyn spoke about earlier. And isn't just a theoretical discussion in academia. The White Earth Band of Ojibwe recently recognized the personhood rights of wild rice in an effort to thwart oil pipeline construction in their habitat. Some tribal courts are beginning to draw from traditional gender and familial beliefs rather than US federal law and domestic violence, divorce, and custody cases. And studies have found that Native students in schools that teach entirely in tribal languages are often higher performing than their counterparts in English-only schools, including on English language standardized tests. So one of the reasons that indigenous knowledge is delegitimized is that it's often passed down orally, which is not how we perceive knowledge in Western academia. And unlike Western scientific knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, for example, doesn't claim to be unbiased. It is recognized as within a cultural context and the spiritual knowledge of tribes as well. So Dr. Robin Kimmerer, who's a biology professor and author of the well-known book Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants, advocates for the inclusion of such knowledge in biology education because it offers unique insights and potential models for ecological conservation and combating climate change. She also pushes back against the notion that traditional ecological knowledge is less rigorous than Western science, arguing that both derive from the same concepts of systemic observation of nature. So in 2017, Indigenous scientists who wrote a letter endorsing the March for Science, no, back to the other one.
Oh, back. Oh, did you delete it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Never mind.
Anyway. As I was saying. So in 2017, there was a group of indigenous scientists, including Dr. Rosalyn LaPier, who wrote a letter endorsing the March for Science. Similarly noted that, quote, our tribal communities need more culturally embedded scientists, and at the same time, institutions of Western science need more indigenous perspectives. The next generation of scientists need to be well positioned for growing collaboration with indigenous science. We call for enhanced support for inclusion of indigenous science into mainstream education for the benefit of all, unquote. So before I turn it over to Rosalyn to talk about her current research, I wanted to end with a few questions to the audience that I think are important for anyone in academia, whether they're conducting research or figuring out what to put on their syllabi. And again, these are questions for not just people who are doing maybe American history classes or literature or sociology, but also science and math. So first, whose voices are being centered? How is this knowledge formed? What biases might the creators of this knowledge hold? So for example, in public health, one of the issues is that a lot of evidence-based practice, the data is not developed with communities of color. Oftentimes it's developed, just doing research on men, or doing research on white people, or doing research on middle-class people. So why would these solutions, quote unquote, evidence-based interventions or medications work for other people if they're not even considered as part of, who we should be doing research for? And finally, which I think is a really important one, what do I consider to be legitimate knowledge? Is it people in academia? Is it only peer-reviewed journals? Are you seeing, community members as, oh, this is just anecdotal versus experts in their own way? So those are just things that I think everyone should be thinking about. Whether you're a professor, student, what other jobs there are in academia. Staff, yes. Lovely, supportive staff who we all love.
Okay, so since our time is running short, I will briefly summarize. But one of the things that, one of the reasons I was interested in both listening to Abaki's discussion about knowledge production and kind of the history of knowledge production in American academic life is because this is something that the younger people that I teach are interested in. This is something that they are really pushing back against. And again, when we think about this idea of what is activism, I think that when we see activism in the classroom now, I think a lot of the activism that occurs is a pushback against where does this knowledge come from that we're learning? What voices are we privileging in particular classes? Who are we reading? Why are we reading those people? And as Abaki just said, and especially when you look at some of the scientific research that has been done, who are we doing science with and who is it for? And we do have a tendency to generalize from certain populations that generalization fits all populations. So this is something that students bring those questions to the classroom all of the time. And it's something for us as instructors and professors that we now need to think about as we are thinking about new ways of teaching and learning, which is what the conference is about, and how do we think about those things, how do we address those things, and how do we, listen to the voices of our students who are asking these questions. So I wanted to end with sort of a quote from B. Medicine, who, again, is somebody that I always turn to as somebody, that's not her quote. I'm going to read her quote. I want to end with a quote from B. Medicine, who, again, is somebody that I always turn to as one who is an Indigenous scholar who has done a lot of work in the field, especially of gender relations, which is what I'm interested in. So she has argued that it is not only time for scholars to understand the complex realities of Indigenous people and gender roles of the past as a way to transform the present, but she has also argued that it is imperative that Native women and those who identify with womanhood serve as the scholars of that transformation, and that we need to conduct scholarship based upon our own unique experiences and observations. And I think that she has kind of given a call to action to a lot of different Indigenous scholars to think about being the ones that create our own knowledge. So kind of the discussion of knowledge production, that it needs to be within our own community that we create knowledge for our communities, but also for other people to share. And I'm gonna ask you to back up about a bunch of slides back to a quote. So back up. That's it. So this is a quote from a Hawaiian gentleman from 18 1865, during a time in Hawaiian history where they had numerous newspapers and they became literate in their own language. And one of the things that he was asking was not only that foreigners come, that others come and tell us our stories, but that we be allowed to also tell our stories as well. So, thank you. And I think we're going to open it up for a few minutes of questions before we head off to lunch at 12 o'clock. And today the lunch looks from the menu. Thank you for the to be really interesting. So.